Good afternoon. My name is Jakob Stogaard-Nielsen, and I'm from the School of European Languages, Culture and Society. And on behalf of the organizing committee, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's UCL Lunch Hour lecture. Today's speaker is Senior Lecturer in English, Dr. Hugh Stevens, and he's going to talk about an obscene book, which is always a good topic for a lunch hour lecture. The title of his talk is up here on the screen. It's Mass of Obscenity, the Prosecution and Banning of D.H.Lawrence, Rainbow. Over to you, Hugh. Welcome.
Thank you very much for coming along today. The reason that I wanted to talk today about the rainbow is it's almost exactly 100 years since it was banned. It was banned on the 13th of November in 1915. And so I thought it'd be interesting to sort of look back 100 years at Lawrence's career and kind of take a snapshot. But in thinking about the lecture and wondering what to talk to you about, it seemed to me that there are ways in which the novel The Rainbow is very connected also with his next novel, Women in Love, that he began The Rainbow and Women in Love as one novel, and they kind of split into two. So I might end the lecture with a brief reference to Women in Love, just because I think that helps put Lawrence's sexual politics in context. And the lecture's really got two parts. In the first part of the lecture, I'm just going to go over the history of the prosecution and banning of the novel. So that'll really be looking at what happened in the last months of 1915. And then this is what really gave me a lot of trouble in preparing the lecture, was thinking, what should I then talk about? And it seemed to me that actually the best thing to do would be to look at a number of passages from The Rainbow to give you a chance to judge for yourself whether the novel might be considered obscene, what might obscenity be. And in part, I think this question of what constitutes obscenity, I'd like to think of it in two ways. And one is the question of what is obscene in 1915. What might the 1915 reader, the 1915 literary climate find obscene? And is there something that we might still find obscene in The Rainbow? And that question about how we might read The Rainbow today is really going to be asked in conversation with the big questions of Lawrencean criticism, which I'd like to summarize as one question, which is the question of whether Lawrence is, in fact, a sexual revolutionary or whether he's a patriarchal conservative. And that seems to me the big question that has preoccupied critics of D.H. Lawrence over the last few decades. Okay, now the English first edition of the novel appeared on 30th of September 1915. Lawrence also had an agreement with an American publisher, George H. Doran, who had earned the right to publish his next three books after Sons and Lovers. Methuen actually wasn't very careful in considering The Rainbow before publication, but Doran was. On 14th of October 1915, Doran sent a telegram to J.B. Pinker, Lawrence's agent, saying, "Cannot possibly publish Lawrence's Rainbow in form submitted. Am legally advised distribution would be forbidden." Doran took this decision after having commissioned 6 separate readings of the novel, all of which were damning. So there was quite a strong consensus there. He then paid an editor to consider if changes could be made to the novel to make it publishable. But on the basis of this editor's advice, he concluded that the novel could not be acceptably revised. And in a further telegram to Lawrence's agent, he wrote, "Must positively decline." And so Doran's refusal shows the degree to which Lawrence's writing was defying convention of the time. But there was, in fact, a 1915 American edition of the novel. Another American publisher, Benjamin Hirsch, a liberal who was willing to take risks for radical authors, he also published Joyce and Sherwood Anderson in America when no one else would do, he agreed to publish the novel, but Hirsch was very careful, much more careful than Methuen, about how he proceeded. He recalls that his firm let the book dribble out to the trade with a caution against talking too much about it. This edition sold out without any advertising or any copies for review. Hipsch was a small publisher, and a lawsuit would have put him out of business. So he had no choice but to be careful. His strategy was successful. The reviews of the novel in England had explicitly suggested that the novel should be suppressed. Hipsch, on the other hand, was able to sell out his first edition and thereafter produced a number of limited editions available at $5 a copy, quite a high price for a novel in those days. So Lawrence was published in America, but the cost of publication was that his novel was largely ignored, apart from by those individuals who happened to read it. In England, the novel, on the other hand, received a great deal of attention, but this attention came to ensure that the novel would find few readers. Lawrence had been extremely confident that his new novel was great. He said in his letters that it was a big and beautiful work, really something new in the art of the novel, I think. Or even grander, the voyage of discovery towards the real and eternal and unknown land. Whereas Sons and Lovers had been what Lawrence called in one of his most famous letters, a great tragedy, the tragedy of thousands of young men of England, the tragedy of a young man unable to love another woman because he has left his soul in his mother's hands, The Rainbow would be a novel about love triumphant, a novel that would do Lawrence's work for women better than the suffrage. And Lawrence was so confident in his own writing and in his high opinion of the new novel that this made him reluctant to allow it to be cut by editors mindful of the need to avoid offences against reticence. His letters to his agents suggest that any cuts to the novel would be like cuts to his own body. On 23rd of April, he worried that Methuen won't want to publish, but argued that he must. In order to facilitate this, Lawrence would be willing to take out sentences and phrases, but I won't take out paragraphs or pages, because, he argued, a novel, after all this period of coming into being, has a definite organic form, just as a man has when he is grown. And we don't ask a man to cut his nose off because the public won't like it, because he must have a nose, and his own nose too. On 26th of July, he stated that he would keep his commitment to cut out all the phrases objected to, but insisted again that the paragraphs and passages marked he would not alter. There is nothing offensive in them beyond the very substance they contain, and that is no more offensive than all the rest of the novel. I can't cut them out because they are living parts of an organic whole. Now, Lawrence may have been correct in saying that cutting particular passages would not make the novel less offensive, but both he and Pinker were running a greater risk than they were aware of. In August of 1914, Methuen had rejected an earlier version of the novel because of the explicitness of its sexual representations. And on 1st of February 1915, Lawrence had told his agent to tell Methuen that a revised version of the novel would contain no very flagrant love passages, at least to my thinking. And so we can look at some of the novel later on in the lecture and decide for ourselves whether it contains very flagrant love passages. If it does, either Lawrence was indulging wishful thinking or perhaps in an act of conscious dishonesty. And in fact, what happened on publication was that the novel's very flagrant love passages were found to be so offensive that the novel was banned. Methuen published the novel on 30th September 1915, and the first review, an unsigned review in the Standard, praised the novel. The Standard's reviewer noted that the book deals with the history of 3 generations of a Nottinghamshire family and is a cycle of births, marriages, and deaths. It praises the novel in terms that anticipate the celebration of Lawrence by the influential 20th century critic F.R. Leavis. It says that there is no flaw in the construction. Mr. Lawrence is a writer of exceptional strength. There is vigor of life and thought in all the people, though they do not always know how to use it. The reviewer was aware that the novel might be condemned, but he argued that whatever its reception, it's an important piece of work. Mr. Lawrence has genius enough to excuse his defiance of all conventions. Subsequent reviews, however, did not seem to regard genius as a quality that might justify a defiance of conviction. On the 5th of October, Robert Lind in the Daily News called the book a prolix account of 3 generations of crisis and the Brangwen theory. Family. He complained that the book was witty, tedious, and even in its excrement. It was windy, tedious, and even in its excrement. Sorry, I'm going to have to start again. He complained that the book was windy, tedious, and even in its excitement. Nauseating. Only in satirical art might one be able to tolerate the representation of life as a thing without faith, hope, or charity, heart, humour, or variety, considerateness, honour, or self-control. The book was nothing but a monotonous wilderness of phallicism. A further review complained that Methuen must have failed to read the book and manuscript before publishing it. This reviewer pointed out that if Methuen had only turned to the chapter entitled Shame, they would have realized that it contains a representation of lesbianism, spelt with a capital L. And there's one chapter in the book called Shame in which Ursula has an affair with her schoolmistress, Winifred Inga, and that's undoubtedly one of the things that reviewers and the court found most offensive about the novel. But I won't be concentrating much on that chapter because that seems to me that chapter is not actually what is most disturbing about the book. A further review by James Douglas in The Star was even more aggressive an attack. Douglas complained that there is not a gleam of humour in the novel's fog of eloquent lubricity. The novel's intolerably wearisome, hectic phrases pound away like engines, grinding out a dull, monotonous tune of spiritless sensuality. The only healthy response to the novel would be an astonished laugh at the hard, stiff, pontifical worship of the gross. And he closed by saying that there is no doubt that a book of this kind has no right to exist. And this was one of several reviews of the novel which really challenged the literary establishment to censor the book, as if in direct response to the standard reviewer's argument that Lawrence's genius gave him the right to defy conventions. Douglas claimed that genius is a sacred trust bestowed upon a man to enable him to purify and not to pollute the sanctuary of the soul. And I think these arguments are worth dwelling on, not because I think it would be easy to patronize them, but I think that they're actually making quite intelligent remarks about what it might mean to read a novel about sexual obsession. Lawrence's divine insight, Douglas complained, has been used to tear open cells of horror and to gloat over unfathomable corruption. And this gloating poses an enormous threat to the mind of the unwary reader, who naturally will look to art for some revelation of loveliness and wholesomeness and health and manly ardor. The reader's brain will be corrupted with insanity. His or her godlike mind will be destroyed as their senses will be worn out in vain pursuit of all the imps of grossness. And this attack, I think, is quite intelligent in that it actually attacks Lawrence not for being a bad writer. Douglas goes on to claim that one of the reasons that Lawrence's novel is so dangerous is that its author possesses the heavenly gift of glamour. And so he can weave veils of shimmering meretriciousness round unnameable and unthinkable ugliness. The novel is figured by Douglas as a contagious disease, a dangerous contagious disease, a disease that's particularly threatening at a time when the nation's health was essential because of the glorious struggle being engaged by those moral beings, the young men who are dying for liberty and who are, Douglas claimed, the living repudiation of such impious denials of life as the rainbow. And he closed by saying, a thing like the rainbow has no right to exist in the wind of war. It is a greater menace to our public life than any of the epidemic diseases which we pay our medical officers to fight. The novel threatens to destroy our preservation, the poise and balance of our minds. And so it needs to be isolated or quarantined by the sanitary inspector of literature. That's a continual metaphor of disease and health running through that review. Now, sanitary inspectors of literature responded to these negative reviews and began to act at the beginning of November. On 3rd of November and 5th of November 1915, police officers called at Methuen with a warrant issued under the Obscene Publication Act of 1957 to seize all copies of The Rainbow. Methuen were informed by Detective Inspector Draper of the Criminal Investigation Department of New Scotland Yard that the author of the offending publication would have no voice in the destruction of the books because the action of the police was taken against the publishers, not the author. Lawrence did not even appear in court, and on 17th of November 1915, he told his agent that he had received no notice at all about the suppression of The Rainbow. What's interesting, in fact, is that Lawrence knew very little about what went on in court, and today we know very little more than he did. The only available records of the trial are two newspaper reports in the Times and the Telegraph on 15th of November 1915. And the Times tells us that Methuen and co. were summoned to Bow Street Police Court on 13th of November to show cause why copies of The Rainbow should not be destroyed. The prosecutor, Mr. H. Muscat, told the court that the book was a mass of obscenity, idea, and action throughout. And he read extracts from the same press criticisms of the work, the Times tells us. And so that's the way we can see that it's the press criticisms that got the novel into trouble. And continued that upon the matter being brought to the notice of the authorities, a search warrant was at once obtained. The magistrate, Sir John Dickinson, regretted that a firm of such high repute should have allowed their reputation to be soiled by the publication of this work, and ordered that the copies should be destroyed and that the defendants should pay the costs. Scholars have wondered if there had been efforts behind the scenes to bring about the prosecution, but the account in the Times suggests that the authorities were made aware of the novel's obscenity by the press criticisms, and that it was this negative publicity that had brought about the prosecution. The magistrate offered the opinion that Methuen should have taken steps to suppress the novel after the criticisms had appeared in the press. And Methuen agreed. They made no effort to defend the book, and they admitted to having acted unwisely in not scrutinizing the book again more carefully, and they regretted having published it. Okay, so that's really all we know of the history of the publication. Scholars have tried to find out more, but there's not actually, I don't think there's anything more in the archives that we can learn about this prosecution. So now I want to turn to the question which preoccupied the court, and which is to ask whether the novel was in fact obscene. And looking at passages, I suppose, hopefully illuminate what might constitute obscenity for the 1915 reader. So I'm going to look at 4 passages from The Rainbow, and if I get time, I'm going to end with a passage from Women in Love. So as the reviews point out, the novel has 3 generations of a Midlands family, the Brangwens, and it takes you from about 1840 up to the early years of the 20th century. And there's something very important about the generational pattern in the novel, that this generational pattern is in fact creating for the reader an argument about life, about sex, about sexuality, about how we relate to our social structure, about how we relate to our bodies. And I think if we look at the passages, what I'm kind of hoping to give you, because they're Women in Love and The Rainbow, they're 2 long books, it's really a kind of a short tour of the book, which will help you follow Lawrence's argument. And so let's begin with the first passage, and this is from the first chapter of the novel, How Tom Brangwen Married a Polish Woman. And the narrator tells us that once, when Tom was drunk at a public house, he went upstairs with a prostitute. who seduced him. He was then 19. Now, when Tom Brangwen at 19, a youth fresh like a plant, rooted in his mother and sister, found that he had lain with a prostitute woman in a common public house, he was very much startled. For him, there was until that time only one kind of woman, his mother and sister. He was tormented now with sex desire. His imagination reverted always to lustful scenes. But what really prevented his returning to a loose woman over and above the natural squeamishness was the recollection of the paucity of the last experience. It had been so nothing, so dribbling and functional, that he was ashamed to expose himself to the risk of repetition of it. Now, I think to a courtroom, this is just straightforwardly obscene, and I think the question kind of begins and ends there. But I think to us, that there is really nothing obscene in the passage. Even if the passage is not obscene, this does not mean that the description of Tom's sex life might not cause offense. People might sleep with prostitutes, but this doesn't mean that a novel should tell us that a young man, only 19, once did so. Men and women might be tormented with sex desire, but this doesn't mean that a novel should inform us of the torment. Victorians, like people today, had sexual desires and sexual experiences. The offense that Lawrence is making is to point this out. But actually, I don't want to give much interpretation of these scenes, but in some ways it's a kind of, there is a sexual conservatism there, because Lawrence is actually saying that the experience of casual sex wasn't fulfilling for Tom, that he actually needs to find sexual fulfillment somewhere other than in a casual relationship with a prostitute. So you can see the kind of ways in which the novel might both be considered obscene, but also might be giving you a kind of fairly conservative sexual ethic. Okay, we move from the first generation to the second generation. And in the second generation of the novel, Tom's stepdaughter, Anna, has married his nephew, Will. And here we have a scene, the second scene I'm giving you, the second generation scene, which is a scene of Will thinking about Anna. Will would go all the day waiting for the night to come when he could give himself to the enjoyment of some luxurious absolute of beauty in her. The thought of the hidden resources of her, the undiscovered beauties and ecstatic places of delight in her body, only waiting for him to discover them, sent him slightly insane. He was obsessed. If he did not discover and make known to himself these delights, they might be lost forever. He wished he had 100 men's energies with which to enjoy her. He wished he were a cat, to lick her with a rough, grating, lascivious tongue. He wanted to wallow in her, bury himself in her flesh, cover himself over with her flesh. And now I think the offense is greater, and the offense continues to become greater as the novel proceeds. It's not just that we are told that Will and Anna, a married couple, are having a sexual relationship with each other. One of the things they do in the novel is they reproduce. Between 1883 and about 1900, they have 9 children: Ursula, Gudrun, Teresa, Catherine, William, Cassandra, Tom, Margaret, and a 9th who dies in infancy. So even the Victorian reader might guess that they have some kind of sex with each other. The offense is that Lawrence allows us to imagine just what they do and allows us to see them taking pleasure in what they do. And this pleasure is not just the pleasure of sexual intercourse for the purpose of procreation. They seem to enjoy their bodies regardless. And the passage does not make it difficult for us to imagine that their sexual experiences together are not limited to the procreative act. Now, so I mean that's really I think the fact that it's not just imagining a sexual relationship, but imagining just what might happen in a sexual relationship is certainly something that's difficult for the 1915 literary establishment. And the novel goes on much further in this direction. Sexual pleasure, it seems to be arguing, promises a fulfillment, the access to an absolute beauty, a beauty which is both something we desire, but importantly, something we also dread. And this is made clear in the third passage I'll look at, and this is one of the most notorious passages of the novel, and it takes us over 2 PowerPoint slides. So let's see what happens in passage 3. This was what the love between Will and Anna had become, we are told. A sensuality violent and extreme as death. They had no conscious intimacy, no tenderness of love. It was all the lust and the infinite, maddening intoxication of the sense, a passion of death. Will had always, all his life, had a secret dread of absolute beauty. It had always been like a fetish to him, something to fear, really. He had given way, and with infinite sensual violence, given himself to the realization of the supreme, immoral, absolute beauty in the body of the woman. It seemed to him that it came to being in the body of woman under his touch. Under his touch, even under his sight, absolute beauty was there. But when he neither saw nor touched the perfect place, it was not perfect, it was not there, and he must make it exist. But still the thing terrified him. Sexual pleasure is combined with terror. Awful and threatening it was, dangerous to a degree, even whilst he gave himself to it. It was pure darkness also. All the shameful things of the body revealed themselves to him now with a sort of sinister, tropical beauty. All the shameful, natural and unnatural acts of sensual voluptuousness which he and the woman partook of together, created together, they had their heavy beauty and their delight. Shame, what was it? It was part of extreme delight. It was that part of delight of which man is usually afraid. Why afraid? The secret, shameful things are most terribly beautiful. They accepted shame and were one with it and their most unlicensed pleasures. It was incorporated. It was a bud that blossomed into beauty and heavy, fundamental gratification. And this passage became notorious in the middle of the 20th century when critics began to realize that Lawrence was suggesting that Tom and Anna were having anal sex. The passage is written in what we might think of as Lawrencean, but it might be translated into English. There is an absolute beauty which we can realize if we touch the perfect place. And this beauty seems to be only tangentially connected with love and conscious intimacy. Rather, it is a sensuality, violent and extreme in death. This involves shameful, natural, and unnatural acts. A clinician might rephrase the natural and unnatural as genital and anal. And these, of course, are the terms that Freud uses in his early 20th century writing about sexuality. The passage does not suggest that we can enjoy anal sex because it is clean, healthy, moral, and peaceful. Rather, anal sex is terribly beautiful precisely because it is secret, shameful, immoral, violent, against mankind, unlicensed. Lawrence is collapsing the opposition between the natural and the unnatural. Here he's like Blake, marrying heaven and hell. Shame is incorporated. It is a bud that blossomed into beauty and heavy, fundamental gratification. So there's something terrible and awful about the sexuality now, but it's still celebrated, and the novel is still a kind of epithalamium or a celebration of marriage. And what's interesting about the novel is that in the third generation, this celebration ceases. And in a way, I think that the 1915 reader didn't really consider this argument at all, that you don't need to understand a novel to ban it. The category of obscenity, in certain ways, limits understandings of the novel because it doesn't actually kind of consider the disturbing representation that Lawrence gives of sexuality. And so we'll just turn quickly, I won't say much about it, although perhaps this third passage, which is a passage in which Ursula, the third generation Brangwen, and her partner Anton, she's not on some sand dunes on a moonlit night. This third passage is perhaps the most disturbing and one of the crucial passages in order to understand what Lawrence is saying about sexuality. So we might come back to it in discussion. So this is really, I think these are kinds of passages which are still disturbing to us today. And these are the passages which, this is one of the passages which would get Lawrence in trouble with feminist critics, because it suggests a man who is finding a woman taking sexual pleasure threatening and disturbing. Ursula, we're told, lay motionless with wide open eyes looking at the moon. Anton came direct to her without preliminaries. She held him pinned down at the chest, awful. The fight, the struggle for consummation was terrible. It lasted till it was agony to his soul, till he succumbed, till he gave way as if dead, lay with his face buried, partly in her hair, partly in the sand motionless, as if he would be motionless now forever, hidden away in the dark, buried, only buried. He wanted to be buried in the goodly darkness, only that, and no more. He felt as if a knife were being pushed into his already dead body. With head strained back, he watched, drawn tense for some minutes, watching the unaltering, rigid face like metal in the moonlight, the fixed, unseeing eyes in which slowly the water gathered, shook with glittering moonlight, then surcharged, brimmed over and ran trickling, a tear with its burden of moonlight into the darkness, to fall in the sand. He felt, if ever he must see Ursula again, his bones must be broken, his body crushed, obliterated forever. Now, what's happened in the novel? It's almost as if the novel at this point has kind of changed its argument, and that the celebration of sexuality has become a representation of sexuality as awful and destructive. Now, that's a kind of big critical question, which in a way, I don't want to attempt to answer. I just leave that with you to think about. But I think it also, what it also shows is that these passages, they're still very uncomfortable for the reader. And one of the reasons that they're uncomfortable is that they're moving us very deeply into a consideration of Lawrence's own sexual problems, his own sexual anxieties. And I think that's kind of destructive for him as a novelist. But I want to close now with the opening scene from Women in Love, because I think he gets out of these problems, and the way he gets out of these problems is to dramatize the question of sexuality from without. And suddenly when we get to Women in Love, it's almost as if the rainbow has brought you to a point where the idea of the sexual relationship is no longer a liberation, but it's a kind of crisis. And Women in Love begins with that idea of the sexual relationship as not necessarily fulfilling in its opening scene. And so this is the opening scene to Women in Love, with which I'll close the lecture. Ursula, said Gudrun, don't you really want to get married? Ursula laid her embroidery in her lap and looked up. Her face was calm and considerate. I don't know, she replied. It depends how you mean. Gudrun was slightly taken aback. She watched her sister for some moments. Well, she said ironically, it usually means one thing, but don't you think anyhow you'd be in a better position than you are in now? I might, said Ursula, but I'm not sure. Again, Gudrun paused, slightly irritated. She wanted to be quite definite. You don't think one needs the experience of having been married, she asked. Do you think it need be an experience, replied Ursula. Bound to be in some way or other, said Gudrun coolly. Possibly undesirable, but bound to be an experience of some sort. Not really, said Ursula, more likely to be the end of experience. Gudrun sat very still to attend to this. Of course, she said, there's that to consider. And this brought the conversation to a close. Okay, thank you. And
Thank you very much, Dr. Stevens. Engaging talk. We have 5 minutes for questions, so a couple of questions at least. We should have microphones going around. I think. Yes, there they are. So please wait for a microphone. Put up your hand if you have a question, and wait for a microphone. Yes, we have a question down here, please.
Thank you, Hugh. That was great. I was just wondering, what you were saying about Methuen and the press,
Yeah.
the court case,
Yeah.
and how they sort of admitted that they hadn't. I just wanted, they sort of accepted responsibility for it, apologised for it. I mean, was it a case that they just hadn't read it and so didn't see it, or do we know? Or were they aware of it and just printed it anyway? I was just interested to know about
that. They were concerned about it in the early stages of the editorial process, and they asked Lawrence to make cuts, deletions, etc. And then basically what they did, he had a very experienced agent called J.B. Pinker, and J.B. Pinker assured them that it was going to be all right. Lawrence was assuring Pinker that it was going to be all right. And so I think that what happened is that although they'd been quite careful in reading the novel earlier on in the publication process, they didn't do a careful read later on. And that's what got them into trouble. Whereas the American publishers got the novel at a late point in the day, so they weren't going through this. They just decided no possibility, because they couldn't really at that point ask for a substantial revision because it had already been published in England when they were making those decisions. So I think they just got lazy. But I think it also might be because of the war, it was difficult to act with this kind of thoroughness that they might have acted with if it had been, say, 1913. So I think that probably also played a role in it. Yeah.
Any further questions? Well, I have a question about the trial that I was intrigued by. Were there many trials of this nature at the time? Was it really common not to prosecute the authors?
There was no official censor, so in a way, the literary establishment relied on the publishers to be sensitive to literary standards. The problem with publishing a novel with a high-profile author that's going to be reviewed in all the major newspapers is that that's going to draw a lot of attention to the work. Now, Sons and Lovers, most of the reviewers praised it. One or two said, "Oh, it's a bit dubious." I think with The Rainbow, the temperature of the sort of heated negative reaction was so much higher that it was difficult for the police to ignore that. But so there was no systematic way in which a literary censor. It wasn't like censorship of plays, for instance, that a literary censor was considering every book. There needed to be something which would draw the attention of the book to the prosecutors.
And did it help his authorship that he was tried, or that his books were tried?
No, it basically destroyed his career financially, in that he lived the rest of the war in poverty, and his next novel, although he finished Women in Love at the end of 1916, but it wasn't published until 1920. So in a certain way, it was very destructive to his career. In another way, I think it wasn't as destructive as it might have been, because I think it liberated him to write exactly what he wanted. I think he just decided that if the establishment didn't want him, he would just, and that of course leads up to Lady Chatterley's Lover. But I think if he'd continued to be a published author, Lady Chatterley's Lover might not have taken the form it did. So in a certain way, I think there's a way in which rejection was psychologically liberating, but financially and professionally it was very damaging. So yeah, a mixed, yeah.
Please.
Who really had the authority to bring Methuen to court and oblige them to defend themselves or not?
Who had the authority?
Authority. How did it happen?
Well, public prosecutors charged Methuen with breaking the law. They were charged with breaking the law, the Obscene Publications Act. So I think, it wouldn't happen. It wouldn't happen unless prosecutors were willing to do so. In a way, I think prosecutors could make a case against any publishers. It wouldn't necessarily go through. They obviously thought that they had a high chance. The reviews had made it clear that they wouldn't have that much difficulty, and Matthew, in deciding not to fight the case, obviously made it even easier for them. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, in talking about the history of censorship, have noted that there's a kind of arbitrariness. It's not just what the novel contains, but whether something happens to bring the novel to the attention of the prosecuting authorities. Yeah,
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking Dr. Stevens again for everything.